Hello, I'm Dr. Harper. This video is in Supply Chain Analytics. It's a lecture on logistics. And this lecture will cover distribution configurations and transportation modes. So let's bring up the lecture notes. So the five-stage supply chain model of the flow of information upstream, the flow of material downstream. Let's start with the supplier, manufacturer, distributor, retailer, customer. And first, some initial takeaways. Well, we'll be talking about the different configurations we'll be talking about is direct shipment and then intermediate shipment, which is warehousing, cross-docking, and transshipment. Now, the initial takeaways is the structure of the distribution configuration. The direct shipment is simply a single channel shipping. Intermediate warehousing is traditional shipping. Cross-docking uses warehouses as transfer points, which we'll go into in a little bit more depth. And transshipment shares inventory between facilities at same stage. That's an initial takeaway. It shares a lot more than just inventory, but we get into that in more detail in relationships. But also you have something called a centralized versus decentralized strategies, where the direct shipment and cross-docking could be a centralized strategy, warehousing and transshipment decentralized. We'll get into that. And finally, transportation modes. We have truck, air, rail, water, pipeline, and I'll talk about the different characteristics within each one of those. So let's get into the details. Okay, first of all, the distribution configurations primarily will be direct shipment and then intermediate shipping of warehousing, cross-docking, and transshipment. Now, the objectives of supply chain management, remember, are balance your high service levels with low costs and emphasize continual improvement as you do that. Okay, so first of all, let's have some just schematics. This is not necessarily exactly what's going to happen, but this is a schematic of the concept of each of these four types of configurations. First, direct shipment. You have upstream, directly shipped to downstream customer. The upstream could be a supplier, could be a manufacturer, but essentially what we're talking about is the orders come upstream, and those orders then will be fulfilled and distributed right straight to the customer. There is no intermediate warehousing or strategies. For example, this is a traditional make-to-order operation. Now, the traditional warehousing is upstream will distribute to midstream warehousing, and those inventories will satisfy downstream demand, either distribution or customers or downstream retailers. And so this is traditional warehousing. So this is intermediate shipping. Then cross-docking is an extension of the direct shipment, where upstream you will have decisions that are going to be distributed downstream in the configuration. But then the warehouses are only transfer points. You don't store anything there. Upstream, they are offloaded, and then unloaded to downstream deliveries. And so it's really a intermediate shipping, but a centralized decision making and strategy. An extension of warehousing over here is transshipment. And the transshipment is the same as warehousing, except there's a connection between the different warehouses, and so you have a lateral or a horizontal type of communication. Therefore, and we'll talk about this again more in relationships, therefore, a customer on this warehouse can be satisfied with inventory from this warehouse because of transshipment. Comparison of centralized versus decentralized facilities. Well, over here, this would be considered a centralized facility because the strategy is upstream and centralized. And this is a decentralized because the demand is met with downstream or decentralized decision making here and decentralized decision making here. So these are centralized versus decentralized facilities. Well, optimization for centralized, it's going to be global because you see the entire supply chain, but decentralized is local optimization. Safety stock will be lower with centralized because that's the ultimate risk pooling and inventory risk pooling. The safety stock is higher with decentralized because you're carrying multiple inventories. Therefore, each will have a supply chain for the downstream demand. Facility overhead is lower for centralized because, again, you're shipping everything from one central location. It's higher with decentralized because you're creating multiple facilities downstream. Retailer lead time. Well, it'll be longer with centralized because it goes all the way upstream and downstream. It's shorter with decentralized because it's the last mile is going to be more locally and decentralized. Service levels is lower for centralized and higher for the decentralized, again, because you have multiple inventories closer to the demand. And the service levels are lower for centralized because you have the supply further from the demand because the lead time is greater. The transportation costs are going to be lower for centralized, although that doesn't seem to be logical. But it turns out to be lower because you're shipping all the way down to the customer. But then the decentralized for the supply chain will be a much higher transportation cost because there's multiple deliveries. Each delivery on the downstream will be satisfied in a more detailed fashion. And so you have inventory risk pooling upstream with centralized, but also you can have delivery lowering your transportation costs upstream because then you can pool your delivery. Okay, then the characteristics. Well, the characteristic of centralized direct shipment is usually expensive products, custom products, proprietary products, because then you're dealing with just one centralized supplier, or critical products to make sure they get there on time so there's less risk of the supply chain having disruptions. Conditions. Products with low demand mean high demand variability, critical lead times such as perishable items, and make-to-order inventory strategies. So there's the conditions that usually support direct shipment or centralized type shipping. Now, decentralized shipping. So now decentralized shipping, if you remember, this is decentralized shipping down here. Okay, this is centralized up here, but it's also decentralized shipping. Although it's centralized operations and strategies, they determined how to ship it, but then once it's cross-docked, then the distribution will be down here. And so you still have a decentralized shipping, but you have centralized decision and strategies. And so so the cross-docking is a combination of centralized strategies to determine what the shipping schedule is going to be, but then the shipping is actually satisfied downstream with cross-docking. So the intermediate shipping, so you do have intermediate shipping. So this is intermediate shipping. However, the decision is made upstream on how that intermediate shipping is going to be conducted. Okay, the products, low-cost products, standardized products, staple products, high product variety, and commodities. And so therefore, you have ability to satisfy multiple downstream demand channels. Conditions are products with high demand mean, low demand variability, low cost sensitivity items such as commodities, and make-to-stock inventory strategies. Okay, advantages is allows risk pooling downstream, and also faster last mile delivery to increase service levels. There's where the service levels are increased because it's the last mile. It's very short lead time, therefore you have increased service levels, and also they can be more focused on downstream deliveries. Okay, so let's start looking at each one of these individually. First of all, direct shipment. Direct shipment. Shipments distributed directly from the manufacturer to the customer or the retailer. I say manufacturer, could be a supplier, manufacturer, the originator of the products, whatever they are, and it goes directly to the actual customer, retailer, the end of the last stage of the supply chain. Characteristics. Well, it eliminates warehouses. There's no warehouses. They're there, but they're not used. So it eliminates warehouses. It accommodates critical lead times, such as perishable items. Because with perishable items, the lead time of upstream, downstream has to be very short. Quite often, they're going to be direct shipment. Accommodates critical retailer, that is high-priced custom items. Requirements: established communication systems through the supply chain. In other words, this communication system has to be very well established and also sophisticated and reliable, such that the communications with the demand upstream, delivery downstream is in sync. That's direct shipment. Next, let's look at warehousing. This is traditional warehousing. Well, in traditional warehousing, here we have the warehouse is shipments distributed from stage to stage, traditionally from manufacturer to wholesaler, distributor to retailer. For example, inventory stored in a warehouse to satisfy retailer demand. And so notice I say manufacturer to wholesaler to distributor to retailer. You can have multiple stages, but you're warehousing at every stage to satisfy the downstream demand. So this is the traditional type of stage to stage shipment and configuration. Okay, characteristics is increased service levels for the last mile. So the last mile, you have more focused delivery for the customer and service levels. Increased warehouse inventory cost, because multiple inventories to satisfy downstream demand. Increased warehouse facility costs, because of multiple facilities, not just one. And increased risk pooling capabilities or opportunities at the warehouse, because each warehouse has its own delivery stream, demand stream. And finally, the requirements is the warehouse management systems for large inventories. So here's where the sophisticated warehouse management systems such as Amazon are utilized and optimized within a local optimization within a distribution strategy. Okay. Well, what I said Amazon. Amazon has very sophisticated warehouse management systems, WMS, but that's within the warehouse. That warehousing systems could be at each stage. Okay. Well, Amazon has a much more sophisticated than just having a WMS for each stage. Okay, let's go on. Crossdocking. So crossdocking, the shipments distributed from manufacturer to warehouses, where the warehouses are used as transfer points to distribution to retailer. So that is transfer. So they do distribute to retailer, but they don't really distribute from inventory. They distribute from the inventory upstream that's transferred to downstream deliveries. Specifically, no inventory is stored at the warehouses. Characteristic: decreases manufacturer to retailer cycle time relative to warehousing. It lowers warehouse inventory carrying cost, because there is no carrying cost. It's very minimal. It carries it only long enough to transfer it to ship it downstream. And it allows high product variety downstream, because then upstream the decisions are made and the strategy is made for a larger variety downstream, because each cross-dock will look at downstream demand and downstream product variety. Okay, but the manufacturer to retailer cycle time decreases relative to warehousing, because it ships. In other words, when you warehouse it, the cycle time from the manufacturer from upstream this stage. Okay, let's go back to warehousing. The cycle time from this stage to this stage, from this stage to downstream, that cycle time is much longer, and that's why this is not good for perishable items. But it is faster for cross-docking, because it only transfers here to go downstream, and that's what the manufacturer to retailer cycle time is much lower relative to warehousing, and that's one reason why people do cross-docking. Requirements: due to the vertical integration It requires advanced information systems, again, communication. Requires advanced forecasting capabilities. So upstream, they're making decisions on downstream demand. So the forecasting capabilities have to be advanced. Requires advanced transportation management because the logistics has to be identified what's going downstream from the transfer points or the cross-docking points, and requires much higher startup costs to get it established because you have logistics, you have IS, you have facilities, everything has to work together. So there's much more required startup cost and integration with every stage. The last is transshipment. Now in transshipment, the shipments distributed traditionally from manufacturer to wholesaler to distributor to retailer, that's traditional. However, inventory also is shared with facilities at the same stage. So you have a horizontal sharing. For example, inventory stored at multiple warehouses to satisfy demand from multiple retailers downstream. So warehouse A could satisfy the warehouse A customers, but the warehouse inventory could also satisfy warehouse B customers through transshipment. Increased virtual inventory because of that. So you have the characteristic of increased virtual inventory, but as it turns out, with the relationships, when you have virtual inventory and you share inventory between stages, the same stage, then you're sharing more than just inventory, and we'll see that later in relationships. Increase risk pooling by use of the same stage facility inventories, because now you have larger virtual inventories, and so you can have much more advanced and increased advantages through risk pooling. Requirements. Due to horizontal integration of inventory between same stage facilities, it requires specialized communication capabilities. So now from the warehousing, now you have to increase the communication capabilities horizontally, but with different facilities at the same stage. Requires specialized transportation capabilities, of course. It goes between stages. Okay, summary and analysis and application. First of all, what are the primary characteristics of each configuration? Well, for warehousing, you can have enhanced inventory risk pooling. For cross-docking, there are no warehouse holding costs because there is no carrying cost there. There's no holding cost at all. But you do have warehouse facilities, but no holding costs. For direct shipment, there are no warehousing costs at all because they don't even exist. For transshipment, there's where you have a large customer virtual inventory. So these are the primary characteristics. Of course, there's other characteristics. These are the primary characteristics. Now, these primary characteristics could be used to say, what factors would be related to the change from one configuration to the other? Well, you start with these primary characteristics. When one becomes more important than another, you might want to think of a different kind of configuration. And so this is left open for application. There's no set answer here from warehousing to cross-docking, warehousing to shipment. So each one of these really depends on the application, the industry, the company, the supply chain, the partners. And so these characteristics up here, along with the configurations, are used to determine when would you move from one to the other and when would one have a better advantage over the other for a very specific application. So each application is different, and each application would have to bring to the table the knowledge and ability to create strategies for the different type of configurations. Okay, finally, what would be the indications that support distributed and centralized, or distributed versus centralized strategies? Okay, and here's where you back up a little bit more for strategy. Say, well, when would you have a distributed inventory, like warehousing or transshipment? When would you have a centralized inventory, like direct shipment or cross-docking? When would you have distributed information, like warehousing or transshipment, or centralized information, like with direct shipment or cross-docking. And so, what would be indications that would support distributed versus centralized strategies, whether it be inventory or information or a combination thereof? Okay, so this again depends on the application, depends on the industry, depends on the company, depends on the business model that company has, and also the objectives and the development of their supply chain. The last thing we're covering in this lecture is modes of transportation, and these are just some characteristics. For example, we're looking at truck, air, rail, and water. And it's really good to look at the different modes of transportation and the characteristics on when they're used and why they're used, and should they be used or should they not be used. First of all, the truck. The truck is a very short distance, small. The size of load is small. You can't have trucks overseas, and the cost is medium and the speed is medium, and so the truck is the last mile preferred mode of transportation. And that's the last mile. In other words, that's the last mile to the customer, and then you're done. Air. Well, airlines, you have a very long distance. They can go from continent to continent. You have very small size of the loads. You can't have large loads because of the airlines. Yes, you can go overseas. It's a preferred, air would be a preferred mode of transportation overseas with small loads because it's high cost and the speed is very fast. And so you can visualize what products would fit with a very long distance, very small size, overseas, high cost, but very fast speed, getting it there quickly. But then you have rail. Now, rail is, again, long distance, large, very large loads, no overseas because it's all domestic now, and it's at extremely low cost. It's a low cost, but a very slow speed. So now you have domestic transportation with large size loads, long distances, low cost, and a slow speed. And so then finally water is long distance and large loads again, but this time we have overseas. We can go overseas. And usually these barges, these containers are extremely large, are huge, so therefore the cost is very low and the speed is very slow. Okay, and so would the air, rail, water, truck, would those modes of transportation be used with only one product? Would one product use only one of those? I mean, the other way? No. From a commodity upstream to the subcomponents to the final distribution to the customer, you'll have multiple modes of transportation usually. And so therefore the different types of configurations cannot be really have strategies without understanding the modes of transportation. Okay, we'll get more into this in the homework and more into this in the lectures in class. That's all I have for this logistics lecture as an introduction to distribution configurations and transportation modes, getting us set up, getting us ready for conversation and discussions later in the course, especially with the homework. That's all I have. Between now and the next time I see you, I want to urge everyone to be safe and take care.